part of the work of attending to others was motivated by social anxiety, really. It was when I realized that when you stop thinking about how you're being perceived and how others are reacting to you and you focus on the other person, that's when you can actually relax and enjoy yourself.
Welcome to Who's Missing, a podcast that gets you thinking about who's missing from your world at work and in life. Today, we're talking to Tess Gunty. She's a novelist, and she recently won the 2022 National Book Award for Fiction for her very first published novel, The Rabbit Hutch, which I read, and let me tell you, I could not put it down. It's like nothing I've ever read before. I met Tess through Christina Reese, our producer, and my very dear friend. She joins us today to discuss the importance of paying attention, the journey behind writing her book, and the experience of living such a public life now as a self-described introvert. I can think of no better way to kick off season 2. When I think of Tess, the word that comes to mind is intention. And with that, I'm Emily Drake, and this is Who's Missing. I'm going to let you see me just until we get started. Hello.
Perfect. Hello.
Hello. I've never done one of these without camera, but I have obviously, like a normal person, talked on the phone plenty of times in my life, so it's going to be just fine.
Thank you so much for being willing to do that.
I want to affirm just sort of like asking for what you need and what works for you. I find even in meetings that I have today, like people just cancel or don't show up versus saying they need an accommodation of some kind or want one. Mm-hmm. So good work, sister. You inspire.
Thank you.
I'm so happy. Okay, I'm going to go off video so it's not weird. Yeah, I'm really obviously excited to talk to you. Remind me how you met Christina.
So my birthday party a few years ago, I invited one of my partner's friends, Claire, and she came with Christina, and we learned that Christina lived just down the street from me, so we were true neighbors. And yeah, ever since then, we've been friends. She's such a wonderful person. I could not be friends with her after that.
Yeah, I'm also a disciple of Christina. I literally will follow and support her in anything she does. She's such an incredible person.
Oh.
Who's the last new friend that you've made? Have you made any new friends on this exciting adventure you're on?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, there are a few people who have been, we've kind of been in the same class almost. It's like that we published at the same time, debut fiction. And so we've been up for similar awards. And there are a few people that I love meeting and I love their work. One of the writers is named Jonathan Escoffrey, and he wrote this book called If I Survive You. And I've been seeing him. I actually also met him at a birthday party of my own.
Was it your birthday party?
It was my own birthday party.
Oh my gosh.
It was a few years ago. It was the year I moved to LA, and my friends, I didn't know anyone, so my friends invited all their friends, and he was one of them. And then it was just so happened that we both published books at the same time years later. And so I've seen him at a lot of stuff and really admire his work. And then another writer who lives in LA named Laura Worrell, and she wrote a book called Sweet, Soft, Plenty Rhythm that is fantastic. But yeah, a lot of people like that where you just kind of, I keep bumping into them in places.
Yeah. I'm imagining too, I listened to your unscripted acceptance speech.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to vomit thinking about it.
First of all, was it really unscripted?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh. It was, you've watched it since?
I think I forced myself to watch it half a time, and then I couldn't. I really spiraled after it. I couldn't believe it. Because, the rest of the people, I was the last person to go, and the rest of the winners had all prepared these unbelievably beautiful speeches. And then I couldn't believe I didn't prepare one. I had received advice from someone not to, and I was like, okay, that makes me feel better, so I'm going to not. And then, of course, it's the most watched thing of all time of my own.
Well, one of the things you said, allow me, because it really resonated for me. You said, attention is the most sacred resource, and you sort of ended with this like kindness wins. And I'm just wondering for you, and as we talk about friendship, and I think, you know, whether it's been sort of socially disclosed to Christina, or you're more broadly open about preferring introversion. What do you make of attention and friendship, and how do you balance it with the relationships with the people in your life?
Well, I really believe that close attention to others and to oneself is the bedrock of all transformative acts of compassion. And so whether it's someone you know very well or someone you've never met before, there's a quote from Simone Weil, she wasn't officially Catholic. She was born Jewish, but she kind of participated in Catholic thinking and wrote a lot of Catholic work that's kind of considered in the Catholic theological canon now. And she wrote in an essay called Attention and Will, she wrote, "To know that this man who is hungry and thirsty really exists as much as I do, that is enough, the rest will follow." And I read that when I was 20, I think, and I just found it to be so correct. And of course, now there are so many demands on our attention, and our attention is being commodified in a very explicit way. It's the attention extraction economy. And so for me, the best I can do is to sort of consciously opt out of those commodification systems as often as I can. I just deactivated my Instagram. I don't have any other social media now. And I find that those kinds of steps are really helpful.
We get asked a lot in my line of work to talk about time management. Everyone's looking for like the optimization experience, you know, the real like question behind that is like, how can I do more? And what you're saying, what I hear you saying is something that we believe, which is focus is the only thing that we can manage. And even that is challenged all the time. I'm wondering, in this very sort of external life you're having right now, what would you put on the list of things that you're focusing on for yourself, along with, you know, the work and promoting the book? How do you focus on yourself too?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are a few things. Right now, I was just traveling for about 6 months, and then when I got home in January, I was told that was going to be the end of the tour, more or less. And so I thought, I'm going to focus now on just recovering and reconnecting with the things that I love the most, just being with my friends, being home, being with my partner and my cats, and, you know, my writing. I hadn't really been able to write anything that I wanted to keep when I was on tour. So that was the goal. And then I really allowed myself to say no to things, to stay home, to sleep, and to really rest. I realized that I hadn't really allowed myself to rest properly in a long time. But then I just learned that I have to go on another tour, for about, you know, I think it's going to be more intense actually than the last one. So before any of this began, before the book published, I was able to go to Paris to give a kind of reading at this program from NYU. They do a summer program in Paris every year. And I did my MFA at NYU, so a lot of my professors from that time were there. And I was asking them what advice they gave to a first-time writer, especially when it came to maintaining mental health during this kind of upheaval. And they all said, try to enjoy it. And then I would say, did you ever enjoy it? And they said, no, never. Every single one of them. But I found that those words were kind of echoing around in my head throughout all the travel and the kind of the upheaval. I would be in a room of booksellers, or I'd be at an award ceremony, or I'd be, you know, traveling in another country, and I found that the act of trying, really, really trying to enjoy it was the same as the act of trying to exist only in that moment and not be projecting or worrying about something that happened before or something that's about to happen. And so, especially at the National Book Awards ceremony, before I won, I really felt like I was in the moment and enjoying everything. I felt it was like this kind of rare experience of joy as it was all happening. And I think that's because I so fully internalized that I wouldn't win, that I was able to relax. And then when I won, I really kind of left my body for the rest of the night and probably some days after. But yeah, I think the attempt to enjoy really is the attempt to also be fully present to the people I'm around and to just attend to them, to really pay attention to what they're saying. And that always helps me.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you can tell me about maybe one particularly challenging stretch of this adventure, realizing that you can start wherever you want with where the adventure starts. I'm not sure what date you'd give it, of writing your first novel, and the one particularly joyous memory and how you've balanced that in your brain.
Oh, well, I think the most difficult stretch of this journey, so I was working on the book for about 5 years before I submitted it anywhere. And there'd be two things that are kind of related. One was I had finished, before I wrote this, I wrote a short story collection of kind of linked stories, and that was the book that I finished first. So right after I graduated my MFA, I was still living in New York, and I decided to share it with a couple editors that were kind of acquaintances. And both of them essentially told me to put it in a drawer and to consider it practice for the next. And I knew that this was not, this is very far from the end of anyone's career. It was early on, and I think they were right. And their point was also that it's very, very hard to market short stories, especially these were quite experimental short stories, and you don't really necessarily want that to be your first work out in the world. There are obviously exceptions to this, but I think I interpreted it as a kind of wholesale rejection of what I was doing and what I was attempting, and I kind of fell into a depression. And it also gave me the impression that publishing was very risk averse. I don't know if this is even what these people intended to communicate to me, but I received the impression that publishing was not going to receive something that was peculiar or, breaking out from the kind of conventional realism that I saw celebrated around me. And so when I finished this book 5 years later, this novel, I was pretty certain that it was going to receive the same response. I knew it was peculiar, it was structured in a kind of unconventional way. Of course, nothing is truly new. I knew it wasn't like the first time anyone had written a novel structured like this, but I was having trouble identifying, books within the past 5 years that were similar. And so I just fully believed that there would be no place for this book. And by that time I hadn't had health insurance since I'd graduated the MFA. I hadn't been able to really make a living. I had just been kind of staying afloat, and I didn't see a way out of it. And I had applied for a PhD at USC in creative writing. I think the order of events was that I submitted this book to agents finally at the kind of urging of my friend Kate. And then a few weeks before that, I had applied to this. A few months before that, I applied for this PhD program in creative writing and literature. And I found out that I didn't get into the program a few weeks after I had submitted to agents, which means, a lot of them say that if you don't hear from us within a few weeks, just assume we've passed on the project. So I was like, okay, now even my safety option, which was this PhD program that I really wanted to do, but it was also something that felt like a buffer, a safety net. I'm not getting into that, and nobody wants to publish my book. So yeah, so those days, and then my partner he had to go out of town the day that I was rejected from USC, and so I was just alone thinking about all this. That was definitely the lowest point. And then miraculously, this professor I had at NYU, Jonathan Safran Foer, who I worked with him on his own work of nonfiction as a research assistant. He called me out of the blue, and he was describing another project that he was thinking about working on. He was kind of looking for another research assistant. And he asked what else I'd been working on, and I mentioned that I had submitted to agents, but I hadn't heard back from anyone, and I guess I had to accept that they'd all passed. And he said, "Why didn't you tell me? I'm going to send them a message and just tell them to read your work, because most of these agents don't have time to read all the submissions they receive. And they have to read all the submissions they receive outside of their work hours, and I promise you that most of them probably haven't even opened your book yet." And I was I was willing to accept help for sure. I was so happy that he was offering, but I also was skeptical that it would work. And then as soon as he sent the emails, everyone responded and said, "We're so sorry to keep you waiting. I can't wait to read your book. I'm reading it now and I'm loving it, And then from there, things moved very, very fast. And soon the agent of my dreams wanted to represent it, and then very soon after it sold. So that was a very extreme shift from there's no hope in my life to my life changed overnight into this kind of dream career.
Yeah. Obviously, I want to talk about your novel. I'll front load it with, I must have turned to Arnie, my partner, a dozen times while reading it to say, like, this is so smart. How does she know so much about so many things? And then I watched your illustration, the vignettes on the Barnes & Noble video, and then read about your brother, and I was just like, who is this lady? So, like, definitely intoxicated by the book and the writing. And I'm not, and I'll just confess this, I'm not a big reader. I'm an aspiring big reader, I don't have any shame associated with it, but it's like I should read more, right? So it's a big deal for me to open up a book and get swept away with it. And I'm actually, I think, at a place in my life where, like, if I'm not swept away, I don't read it. It's the same with music. It's the same, right? I'm 43, so let's not, waste any time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm wondering how you move from that place of kind of like, oh man, I guess this isn't it. I guess, this is how it's going to be, rejection, depression, into a place where, at least when I watch you speak, and I said this to Arnie yesterday too, there's such a poise and confidence, even if I don't know what's happening inside for you. So help us understand that, like, what we see and what's happening inside for you at this stage.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I really appreciate that. I used to do a lot of theater. I loved it growing up, and I wasn't particularly gifted at it, but I just loved it. And I think that helped me a lot, because there's something that happens when you're in the middle of a performance where you just, another switch flips on inside of you, and you're not yourself. You're kind of this other, you're the character, and you know exactly what to do and where to go. And I was doing a lot of musicals, so there was a lot of singing and dancing involved. And I think that's prepared me for this kind of presentational phase of the work. I feel the same switch flipping. And sometimes, right before an event, I can feel that it's not switching on, and I kind of panic. But then most of the time it does end up switching at some point. But it's funny because it seems completely involuntary. Like, I don't think I can control it at all, but it does help. And a similar thing happened to me when I used to work at a bakery when I was in high school. I just sold the bread during the day. And I would work at the farmer's market on weekends, and it was a very social environment, and you had to be very, outward facing. And it was just a little bread selling job at a market. But for some reason, this was a very transformative experience for me. People would just kind of stop and talk and tell me about their life stories. It was often older people who were maybe left behind by others, and they were lonely, and they just wanted to tell someone about their life. And I found that the same thing happened, where a kind of external force enabled me to kind of get out of my normal introversion and shyness, and slip into this other person who was present to others and, more confident than I naturally feel. Yeah, I think as a kid I was extremely shy, extremely shy, and I had a lot of separation anxiety with my mother and, all of that. And so I think as I got older, part of the work of attending to others was motivated by social anxiety, really. It was when I realized that when you stop thinking about how you're being perceived and how others are reacting to you, and you focus on the other person, that's when you can actually relax and enjoy yourself. So yeah, I often find that extroverts tend to have more speaking anxiety than introverts that I meet, like public speaking anxiety. And I wonder if that's because introverts have to kind of step outside of themselves in order to do it, and extroverts remain within their identities as they try to do it, and that's why it's so terrifying. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just a pattern I've noticed.
Yeah. I think about, again, sort of observing your composure, but also just like what you say. I think not a lot of people have the experience of like, if you Google my name, you might find a few things. If we Google your name, we're going to find a lot of things. But like this study of like how people show up. And I think, everyone loves a confidently humble person, right? Like this awareness, I'm one among many, but also that I'm just going to say it, exceptional in some ways. And so there, I think, whether you be extroverted or introverted and have that preference, it's very rare that we get to observe someone really in process with it, which is why I wanted to, why it was so curious to me to be like, are you confident, Tess? Because people will say to me, Emily, you seem so confident. And there are things, because I've done them so many times, that my body just does for me. And so a lot of what you're describing is just switches, right? It's involuntary. I'm not actually making anything happen. But I wonder for you, if I ask you that question, are you confident? What does it bring up for you? Because everybody wants it. Everybody wants to, you know what I mean? Especially women leaders, I find.
I don't think I would characterize myself as a confident person. I think probably a lack of confidence has been actually I had a mentor who once told me that's your Achilles heel. And certainly people who know me best probably would say that, yeah, a lack of confidence is the thing that's almost always standing in my way. But I do find that during this kind of presentational process phase of publication, I think because you're kind of also representing your publisher and you're also representing your editor and your agent, and obviously nobody else's career is riding on this. I'm not under that delusion, but I think it helps me to think about not just doing this to promote myself and my product, but rather I am part of a kind of community of people who have made this book come into existence, and I am the representative for it. So when I think about it that way, I find that the work of promoting it is much easier, or it's not as fraught with kind of self-doubt. Yeah. But it's also, it is involuntary. I think I kind of slip into a different mode even when I don't feel confident.
Yeah. It reminds me of the acknowledgments at the end of the book, sort of bringing you back to earth of it does take a lot of people, doesn't it, to create a work, but also something that came up for me as I was thinking about you and thinking about the book. And this is maybe not an experience I have, and maybe not an experience that many of our listeners will have of what does it feel like to sit within a body of work for so long? From the 5 years prior, this conception you had, and I know you submitted the first 70 pages as part of your thesis, and so you've been living with it for so long. At what point, at least mentally, emotionally, maybe, do you close the door on the first to move on to the second, just in your inner world?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the kind of literary fiction world, it is a very long-term commitment to write a novel. And so most of my friends who have written novels either do so very quickly and kind of in this manic burst, or they do so over the course of a very long time, maybe even longer than 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And so I think that it is slightly standard, especially for your first book, to take time to get off the ground. But when you're in your 20s, there's almost nothing that I had committed to for that long. I'd never been in a school for that long. I'd never been in a relationship for 5 years. So it was really the longest relationship that I had been in. And I think part of the reason why I was able to finish this book was because it was a more capacious form, and so it was able to mature as I matured, and it was able to change as I changed. And the fact that it involved so many characters and perspectives I never felt suffocated or trapped or claustrophobic within the structure, which I had in, I think, other things I'd tried. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, I was just talking to some friends about this last night, I had to read the audiobook because the woman who was supposed to read it, the actress who was supposed to read it, she got COVID right before she was supposed to record, and they were on a really tight schedule, and they said, well, we have this studio reserved in LA, do you want to do it? And so I did it, and they had other actors reading some first-person parts as well. But that was a very important emotional experience because it was a kind of a graduation ceremony for my book. It felt like this is the first time I've read it all without being able to change anything. And it's the first time that I started to feel some distance from it. And I think from that point forward, I was able to kind of see it as its own animal that was out in the world and had its own will and volition, and it would do its own thing. And so I do think that the promotion, even though you're actually closer to it than ever in some ways, it requires a certain amount of distance in order to analyze and talk about your work. That's been helpful.
Tess Gunty's choice for this week's Spotlight is on an organization called Giving What We Can. It allows people to make high-impact donations to the causes of their choice. Tess talks about this beautifully in this episode, so be sure to stick around and listen to that. And if you want to learn more, visit givingwhatwecan.org. And now, back to the show. It occurs to me that I haven't said the name of the book yet. I'm so fascinated by you. So The Rabbit Hutch, we all have different ways we'll identify with any book, but I'm wondering, just as you interact with your audience and the readers, has anyone mirrored back for you something that you really hadn't thought about as a way to describe The Rabbit Hutch?
I think I've tried so hard to kind of distance myself from reviews or, certainly like the online reviews but I have been, personally contacted. When I used to have Instagram, some readers would reach out. And most of the time I'm just so grateful that people are reading it at all, let alone, finding so much within it that resonates and having extreme emotional reactions to it. Any kind of extreme emotional reaction to me is kind of amazing. You can have that kind of intimate relationship with words, a collection of words. One thing I love about this process is how different the book is in each reader's imagination. But I would say another thing that keeps coming up that I am sort of peripherally aware of, even though I try not to read reviews, is I think a lot of readers kind of... the term manic pixie dream girl comes up a lot when Blondine is being described by, not really in official reviews, but in reader responses online. And I find this kind of fascinating because I think what they're picking up on is that her life is kind of positioned within this incredibly patriarchal, sexist environment where all of the men around her are trying to make her the peripheral character in their narratives. And I really intentionally wanted to write a young woman who was facing those forces, who was resisting them at every turn and was like insisting on carving out her own narrative rather than submitting to these extremely overpowering forces around her. And so in some ways I find that kind of feedback, like I see where it's coming from, but I think for me, my fundamental understanding of the manic pixie dream girl and why that's problematic is because she only exists as a function in the plot of the male narrative, like in Elizabethtown or 500 Days of Summer or other films like that, where it's about a sad man who meets this kind of magical woman who kind of takes him out of his depression and into this world of color and vivacity again. And for me, that was just absolutely not what Blondine is doing. Yeah, she's really kind of relentlessly insisting on being the main character of her own life. But the feedback really forced me to reflect on how tricky it is to show the patriarchy and sexism that she would experience without replicating it on the page.
Mm-hmm. What I hear is intentionality, and really being purposeful with what we're doing, not to obsess and make it perfect, but to really have that self-awareness, and then go forth into the world to do this work, this compassionate work we need to do, but from a place that really isn't typecast, but is sort of authentic in expression. And I think that's really hard. So I just wonder, what were you trying to do, if you have even an articulation for that, with creating Blondine as a character? And did you do it, do you think, based on what you've heard?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, it's an odd question in some ways, because in my kind of drafting process, I try not to kind of impose any agenda or like structure or outline on the work. I really believe that when you're kind of trusting an associative subconscious logic, whatever you care about most will surface, and it'll be more interesting and more truthful and more surprising if you trust that logic versus this kind of more conscious logic. But then, of course, when you're revising, you have to be extremely intentional and conscientious about what you're doing. So I think it'd be probably fraudulent to pretend like I had some plan or vision when I first started writing her. But it is true that as she kind of formed herself on the page, I realized that she was the hero that I kind of wanted to see. I think at the time, I began writing this when I was 23, and she was, not so distant from it. She's 18, but that's not so distant from 23. And I think I had felt so boxed in. I had felt people trying to typecast me throughout my life, depending on my appearance or my interests, or, what every single person probably experiences this. And I think the more marginalized your identity happens to be, the more intensely you feel cornered into boxes. But one thing that was so frustrating to me was that there seemed to be a very narrow understanding of female intelligence and power where I was growing up. It was a very Catholic environment. It was in the Midwest, and I think a lot of archaic ideas about femininity were still operating there. And I felt that what was so liberating about creating Blondine was that she just refuses to participate in any of the narratives that people are trying to typecast her into. And part of that is because she's so relentlessly herself. She is interested in the things she's interested in unapologetically, and she cares about the causes she cares about unapologetically. And her methods of kind of interrupting, or her methods of activism, are so unexpected and so wild. And I love her activism because it seems to be motivated from a place of almost a visceral need to disrupt things. Like she's not necessarily convinced that any of her activism is going to come to fruition, or, in this case, she's protesting a development plan. I don't think she thinks that it's going to stop because of her meddling, but she does it because she cannot live with herself. She can't live with this space if she allows what she perceives to be injustices to simply move forward. And I also I loved the idea of creating a female character who was unapologetically and undoubtedly brilliant. She's really intelligent. Her intelligence takes a kind of particular form. She really defines herself only by the things that she can derive real value from, like her mind, her curiosity, her activism. And everyone around her is trying to get her to kind of just be a pretty girl, And I think beauty was something that I was trying to interrogate as well. It's this resource that I think young girls from a very young age receive the message that physical beauty, a conventional physical beauty, whatever that means, is the most important resource that you could possibly possess and cultivate. And if you have that, then you don't need anything else. You don't need a personality or a sense of humor or a brain. And that, this will be this truly mobilizing resource. And I think for Blondine, a part of the kind of wish fulfillment of writing her was to show how untrue that was. It was just, for her, it was a currency just like any other that was a fiction that kind of propped up those in power at the expense of everyone else. So for her, the kind of attention she receives, or maybe the opportunities that she receives because people perceive her as beautiful, are repugnant and actually quite invasive and violating. And so, I think part of writing that character was also interrogating the myth of beauty.
Do you have any reservations about The Rabbit Hutch being turned into a screenplay or a movie?
Well, right now it's just optioned for the rights. So I think only about 1% of the material that's optioned actually ends up getting made. But if it did get made, the producer who optioned the rights said to me, recently asked if I wanted to write the screenplay, and I realized that I really don't have any desire to do so.
Yeah.
I wish I was like trying to summon the desire, but I just was like, I really think that I'm more interested in finding out how someone else interprets this material. That the idea of that, the more different it is, or the more they change things. Obviously, there are certain, choices that I would question, but I'm most interested in seeing how someone else, how this kind of the chemical reaction with their imagination. And I do think I am someone who sort of like I've already had to achieve so much distance with this work. It would be very difficult to re-enter it and try to live inside of it again. Yeah.
Is there anything you feel like has been unsaid or you want to lift up as it relates to what you're an activist about? Either be it, promoting your novel, which is your job, or is there anything else that you'd want to leave us with?
I just finished this book called What We Owe the Future by a philosopher named William McCaskill. And this book is kind of making the argument for long-termism, meaning, taking future generations as serious moral concerns, providing for them a world that is livable is a very serious moral concern. And I learned when I was researching him that he also co-founded this movement called Giving What We Can. William McCaskill now gives, I think, over 50% of his income, anything above the median UK income, which is about £32,000. He donates to these high-impact charities, most of which are international. So, for example, he said, if you are making the median income in the UK and you give away 10% of that, that's about £3,000 a year, you could save a life from malaria every single year. And I was always so skeptical of the kind of, money-focused efforts to solve problems. I mean, it sounds silly when I'm saying that because, of course, all these problems require money. But, I didn't have much money for most of my life. So I thought this is not a sustainable model. But he really persuaded me otherwise when he talked about how, for example, you could try to make your carbon footprint zero and do everything you can to do that, but then the effect would be like you never lived. That's the best effect. Whereas if you give a percentage of your income, you could have an effect that's magnitudes greater on environmental justice. So you can go to the website Giving What We Can, and you can see they've kind of arranged these high impact nonprofits, and it's very transparent. It will tell you what each thing is doing, and you can kind of click around and see what means something to you. I now give a certain amount every month to malaria prevention in Africa, and I think it's a really incredible movement, to just get people to kind of think about ways that they can make a change with even a small donation. But his focus is now, I think, mostly on getting millionaires and billionaires to join the 10% tithing movement.
Good use of tithing.
Yeah.
Tess, thank you. Thank you so much for your time and your graciousness, and big fan.
Likewise.
Just of you as a human, and the book's pretty good too.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your flexibility too. I'm so grateful you were able to, reschedule and that you were willing to do the non-camera thing. Thank you so much.
Anytime. Take it easy, Tess. Thanks for everything.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Bye. As always, thank you so much for listening to Who's Missing. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review. It only takes a few seconds and truly makes a huge difference. And if you want to hear from us more than just once a week, you can follow us on Instagram or check out our website where you can subscribe to our newsletter, read about our guests, check out a bunch of awesome resources, or send us a message if you have questions or comments. Feedback is welcome. Sounds great, right? Yeah, join us. What are you waiting for? Visit us at www.who'smissingpodcast.com or on IG at Who's Missing Podcast. Talk to you soon.